Slavery in the Spanish Philippines by William Henry Scott. The Law and the Practice. The Laws of the Indies, La Recopilación de Leyes de los Reinos de las Indias, were a compilation of royal decrees or cédulas issued for the governance of Spanish colonies in the Caribbean, mainland America, and the Philippines. These were collectively called the West and East Indies to distinguish them from India itself, that is, India Oriental, whose inhabitants were generally referred to by the names of their countries, Bengalese, Malabars, etc., rather than as Indios. Naturally, the compilation did not include all the hundreds of decrees and instructions handed down, but was a selection intended to include both those originally promulgated as basic laws and those deciding specific cases which could serve as precedents. Slavery was mainly covered under the title Duties on Slaves, de los Derechos de Esclavos, and non-slavery, so to speak, under Liberty of the Indios, de la Libertad de los Indios. The decrees included under the first title were, as the name implies, largely concerned with protecting the crown's proceeds in the slave trade. Slaves were not to be imported without license from the king or his recognized contractor, nor landed without the knowledge of royal officials. Import duties were to be collected and registered on all slaves and other merchandise, including those from the Philippines. And slaves disembarked illegally were to be seized and confiscated. No slaves could be introduced who came from the Levant or had been servants of Muslims, nor any gypsies or their children or servants, nor any educated Negro who had spent more than 2 years in Spain. But one law revealed a humanitarian concern. Married slaves must not be separated from each other, and female slaves were forbidden on the Trans-Pacific Passage to the Philippines because of the offense which might be given God during so long and lonely a voyage. Laws under the title Liberty of the Indios prohibited Spaniards from holding Indios as slaves and addressed problems connected with enforcing that prohibition. Philip II, for example, in the first year of his reign, received a case from the Audiencia of Nueva España, Mexico, in which a number of Mexican slaves had claimed and obtained their liberty from masters who had purchased them, already branded in good faith and paid the tax. Should those owners be punished or made to pay back wages? His Majesty's answer, no. Perhaps these slaves were sold by Mexican masters. There was a 1538 law against caciques or principales holding, selling, or trading their own subjects as slaves. This appears to be a corrective to abuse of political power rather than an act of abolition of native slavery. At least it was never cited during the vexed question of legal Philippine slavery. The foundation piece of this section, of course, was Charles V's unambiguous 1526 decree, since it was repeated in 1530, 1532, 1540, 1542, and 1548 and never rescinded. It is worth quoting at length. In the beginning, it was permitted by the Catholic monarchs, our grandparents, that for just causes and careful consideration, war might be waged against certain of the said Indios for not being willing to receive the preaching of our holy Catholic faith, but rather to resist its preaching with arms in hand, which same was tolerated by us afterwards as something which could be permitted by right and by the laws of our realms, without burden to our conscience, and so too we have given permission that the Spanish Christians who have gone to settle in the Sid Indies may be able to buy and hold the native Indios by force, who were slaves they themselves had taken in the wars which they waged against one another, and according to their laws and customs. But in consideration of the great and intolerable harm perceived by members of our Council of the Indies and referred to us, it is now our will, and we have command that, from now on and until such time as we expressly revoke or suspend what is contained in this decree, by making particular mention of it, none of our governors or captains or mayors, or any other person, whatever his state, rank, office, or position, shall presume in time of war, even if it be just and ordered by us, or by those who exercise our authority, to capture the said Indies of the said Indies, islands, and mainland of the ocean sea, discovered or yet to be discovered, or to hold them as slaves, even though they be of islands and lands against which just war has been declared by us, or by those who have been given our authority, and that they might be killed, seized, or captured. Regarding which, in all the said licenses and declarations up to this date, and any made in the future, we revoke or suspend everything that touches on this subject, and in order to prevent any sort of fraud and deceit in this, no person shall presume to take any Indio as slave in war or otherwise, nor hold him as such under title of just war, or for ransom, or by purchase or trade, or under any other title or cause whatsoever, even if he be one of the Indios, whom the natives of the said Indies, islands and mainland, themselves have held, do hold, or might hold among themselves as slaves, under penalty that he who does so shall for the first time he is found with a captive or slave incur the loss of all his goods to our council and fiscal, and that they be then returned and restored to their own land at expense of the ones who captured them. The law therefore did not prohibit either Spanish slavery or Philippine slavery, but forbade Spaniards to hold Filipinos as slaves. The treaty which Legazpi forced on Topas of Cebu in 1565 included a clause stating that if some slave or other person should flee from the Spanish camp, the said chiefs and natives shall be obliged to seize and bring them to the governor. If the slaves Legazpi had in mind were the 3 natives of Mindanao he purchased from Bornean traders for interpreters, although it turned out they could speak neither Visayan nor Malay, they presumably were not Indio subjects of the king. On the same grounds, when Governor Sandy was hoping to conquer Borneo 10 years later, he gave orders that, even should the natives wish to sell slaves, the Spaniards shall not buy them if they are natives of the same island. Nonetheless, given the fact that most slaves available to Spaniards in the Philippines either were or were about to become His Majesty's subjects, it is probably not surprising that felt conquistador needs for domestic help proved stronger than respect for a law promulgated half a world away. In the beginning of the conquest, Spaniards purchased or enslaved Filipinos, or in the case of religious orders, received them as gifts. Spanish captains, acting on their own initiative, seized and sold Filipinos on the coast of Albay and Panay, and during a famine in Iloilo, caused by Filipino failure to plant crops in an attempt to starve the Spaniards out, bought them by the hundreds. Legazpi later claimed that he had freed all Filipino slaves he discovered and punished the men who held them, and commented that they get little use out of them anyway, because they soon run away. Perhaps it was for this reason that Spaniards took a fancy to Negrito slaves, thereby inflating their price, since they had no relatives to hide or rescue them. Legazpi himself sent many Negrito children to Mexico, whence those the king learned about were sent back. The king also rejected the suggestion that it would be less trouble and of more service to God and the Spaniards to buy slaves and take them to Nueva España, where they will become Christians, and supply the great need which there is for them there. But the continuing presence of Spanish slaves is adequately revealed by chance reference. During the Limahun attack on Manila, the slaves who were gathered beneath the governor's house took the opportunity to escape, and Martin de Rada, in vying against the barbarity of native Filipino customs, the next year said, "When some slave of a Spaniard runs away, the first Filipino who meets him seizes him and sells him to another." The occupation of Luzon and division of its population into encomiendas produced an irresistible supply of slave labor as Filipinos went into debt bondage to meet their assessments. Some absentee encomenderos even appointed slave overseers in their stead, though the Synod of Manila forbade this because, with their master's protection, they are at times even more cruel, and as greater loafers, they collect more and oppress other Indios like themselves. The main Spanish employment of Filipino slaves was in housework or unskilled labor connected with Manila's galleon trade. Good housekeeping required them in such numbers that Bishop Diego de Soria could suggest that the donation of one from each household would be sufficient to operate the Igorot gold mines, assuming they could be occupied. A Portuguese visitor commented, "There's no Spanish soldier in these parts, no matter how poor, who doesn't have an Indio slave to serve him, and many 2 or 3. And his countrymen quickly responded to this need from African, Indian, and Malacca markets. But the cruelty and injustice about which friar humanitarians regularly complained to the king obviously referred to his Majesty's Filipino subjects. After all, Bishop Salazar had lived 23 years in slave-holding Nueva España, and he was not now talking about Portuguese imports who arrived branded and were sold registered. Religious houses also needed domestic help. The Augustinian Capitulary Acts of 1572 called for accounts of all possessions, bequests, slaves, and cattle, and in 1574 ordered that all purchased slaves be freed, but in 1627 set a limit of 1 slave per priest, though raising the maximum to 4 in 1650. Convents also kept freed slaves working off redeemed debts, and little slaves who do not serve us here, unless they are people we buy who are then free in our power, the condition that they serve us, in payment for which we give them everything they need. But the average Manila citizen considered Filipino slaves so essential that when one more royal decree arrived in 1581 to set them free, Governor Ronquillo asked Bishop Salazar's advice about holding it in abeyance, considering the opposition which could be expected. The bishop convoked the leading clergy, and they concluded that the law must be implemented exactly, and when slaveholders failed to do so, withheld or threatened to withhold absolution. Emotions ran high, but Ronquillo himself reminded Salazar that he was the grandson of a man who had not hesitated to hang a bishop during the War of the Comuneros. But though the whole imbroglio no doubt increased moral pressure on Spaniards to give up their Filipino slaves, Archbishop Miguel Garcia would still be setting special burial fees for an Indio, Japanese, or Negro slave of a Spaniard 50 years later. And a century later, the Audiencia would report the manumission of 571 Filipinos by Spanish owners. Whatever the Spaniards may have thought about holding Filipino slaves, they were generally agreed that Philippine slavery, unlike Spanish slavery, was morally reprehensible. In 1574, the king, having learned that there are many Indios deprived of their liberty, whom other chiefs have tyrannically enslaved, ordered the appointment of a minister to investigate these cases and restore their victims to their natural liberty. A General Assembly held in Manila in 1586 concluded that of 20 or more different methods of enslavement, not one is justifiable. Though Bishop Salazar thought there are some who really are slaves. Franciscan Tagalist, Plasencia, and San Buenaventura would later think these were the alipin sa gigilyar as distinct from the namamahay. Thus, the 1613 Tagalog dictionary defines gintubo, born slave, with a warning, the Indios say, kintubo ni ama, my father inherited him, before the judges, and those who do not understand the force of this word adjudge them sa gigilyar slaves. The minister the king was referring to was the protector of the Indios, a standard office in the Indies, first held by Bartolome de las Casas, but later in the Philippines by laymen. There was a separate defender for imported slaves. The Synod of Manila instructed them not to meddle in litigation between Indios themselves, except in cases involving minors, orphans, widows, or slaves claiming their liberty, and warned alcaldes mayores hearing such cases, it is clear and manifest robbery to take as much as 2 tostones from any Indio for awarding him a slave. As late as 1719, the king would order the governor to be sure that the protectors of the Indios neither engage in trade nor be served by them. By that time, there was also a special judge called Juez de Libertadis, Justice of Liberties. In 1709, Father Joaquim Ramirez petitioned the Audiencia against Juez de Libertadis, Agustin Barrientos' assignment as a judge in a case he was filing against a runaway slave on the grounds of probable prejudice. But despite all the concern expressed over Philippine slavery, the institution itself was referred to regularly and matter-of-factly in documents of the period. The Acts of the Synod of Manila contain a chapter on encomenderos, managers, collectors, their servants and slaves, and far from condemning slavery, cite a 1582 provision by the Audiencia of Mexico that tribute may be collected from slaves of 15 years or older, and if they have their own possessions, to pay it from them, and if not, their masters for them. Father Chirino referred to the ostentatious generosity of a chief married by one of his Jesuit brothers in Uton by saying that in addition to the dowry, he gave gifts to the bride's parents, relatives, and even her slaves who were very many. And a Duarte praised Magaldan chief Kasipit, who sent his slaves to mass regularly and said, I would rather have my slaves steal my goods than neglect their spiritual duties. Juan de Oliveira's Tagalog exposition on the Ten Commandments, written for converts in Batangas, opens with the following passage. The rich man who has many slaves and a large household teaches everyone what he has to do. He commands that his will may be fulfilled by slaves. He is the one who took them in. He orders some to work in the fields, others to fish, and still others to hunt, so that each one is also assigned his own job. It is also thus with God in all his works. Everybody was aware that a general abolition would not only be unfair to slaveholders, but produce social and economic disruption, if not actual rebellion. The General Assembly of 1586, therefore, proposed a formula for a gradual phase-out for recommendation to the king. All children to be born free, no new slaves to be made, and a fair price to be set by disinterested parties for slaves able to pay it. In Madrid, a royal commission endorsed the plan, but the king did not implement it. Instead, he instructed Governor Gomez Perez Dasmariñas to enforce his and his father's oath against Spaniards holding Filipino slaves. Philip often tried to protect Filipinos from Spanish abuse, but neither on this occasion nor on any other did he attempt to restructure Philippine society. Thus, in practice, Philippine slavery remained a legal institution in the Spanish colony, and even legislation intended to ameliorate its hardships recognized it as such. To relieve slaves of servitude for more than one master, for example, the Audiencia issued an edict in 1598 that when settling an estate, slaves should not be divided but sold, and a purchase price divided, or if one of them retains a slave, he should pay the other heirs for their share. But the following year, they reconsidered and directed that advocates and attorneys should follow native customs in questions of slavery, divisions of inheritance, slaves, marriage, dowries, and other things. In 1608, all slaves were supposedly registered in Leyte and Samar, and their owners given title certificates with understanding that only their descendants would be recognized as slaves in the future. But the problems of executing a colony-wide registration were simply too great. Dr. Antonio de Morga recorded the final pragmatic solution. These slaves are the major wealth and property which the natives of these islands have, because of their being so useful and necessary for their farming and estates, for which reason, as well as to avoid so many lawsuits as there would be if all these cases of slavery and their origins and beginnings had to be dealt with, they are being retained and healed as they healed them before. But although Philippine slavery was not abolished, its numbers were greatly reduced. In the beginning of the conquest, rebellious or uncooperative tatus were deprived of their slaves by punitive or penal action. Lacandula complained that almost all the slaves he had inherited from his ancestors or bought with his own wealth had been given to a soldier with the name of Martin de Rea as an encomienda. Father Alsena said in 1668 that men he had known with 50 or 60 slaves 35 years before now had only one or two, and old datus who had once held 100 or more now scarcely had 10. Some of these slaves were freed in accordance with normal Filipino practice, released by a fund master, liquidation of a debt, or actual payment of their price, and few or none were replaced by captives from slave raids. Hundreds were set free by Christians at the time of conversion or death, and unknown numbers through friar intervention, individual Spanish generosity or successful lawsuits before colonial judges, all of them became tribute-paying Timawa. In 1657, Oidor Salvador Gomez de Espinosa called them free Indios, though descendants of the slaves. Timawa, or what Luarca called true Timawa, in 1582 were described in all early Spanish accounts as men who accompanied their datus on expeditions armed at their own expense, and so were those known by the Malay Sanskrit term Maharlika in more sophisticated Tagalog regions. It was a profession which disappeared from Spanish-controlled areas, of course, and 17th century dictionaries know nothing of this true Timawa, but only free men halfway between dato and slave. So, matitimawa, to be freed, the Mentreda Visayan Dictionary says. And sa ikaapat, ang kamaharlikaan ko, I'm 1/4 free, San Buenaventura says. It was this new Timawa who eventually replaced the Alipin and Uripon, became the class ancestors of the Filipino peasantry, and gave rise to the modern Visayan word Timawa, which means poor, destitute. But the process could take more than a century.